In the 1920s, whispers spread across Wales about a story that would haunt the nation: Mamie Stuart and George Shotton, a tale of secrets, scandal, and unanswered questions that refuse to fade. But before we start, make sure you like and subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. So get ready as we uncover the case of Mamie Stuart and George Shotton. December 1919. A remote cottage called Tai Llanwydd, overlooking Caswell Bay in Swansea, Wales. Amy Stuart, known by her stage name Mamie Stuart, lived there with her husband George Shotton. She was 26 years old. She had been a dancer, a showgirl, part of a troupe that toured the United Kingdom. But those days were behind her now. Her husband had forbidden her from returning to the stage. She lived in isolation in that cottage, far from the life she once knew. Mamie had been born in 1893 in Sunderland to parents James, a ship's captain, and Jane. She had a sister named Edith. Police would later describe her as pretty, with brown hair and grey-blue eyes, about 5'3" to 5'4" tall, with very even teeth except for one missing, and of good carriage. She had left home at 15 to appear on stage, becoming a touring dancer and showgirl. She eventually started her own dance troupe called the Five Verona Girls. The group performed across Britain and became popular in that conservative era for showing their legs, sometimes up to knee height during their routines. It was considered scandalous. In early 1917, the Five Verona Girls came to an end. One girl got pregnant, another broke her ankle. Mamie returned home to Sunderland. In July 1917, aged 24, she met George Shotton. He was a marine engineer, 14 years older than her. He traveled extensively for work. He told Mamie he was a widower. It was a whirlwind romance. Within months, he bought her a diamond ring. On March 25, 1918, they married at South Shields. They honeymooned in Droitwich Spa. But George Shotton had lied. He was not a widower. He was already married. His first wife, Mary Leader, whom he had married on September 7, 1905 in Newport, Monmouthshire, was very much alive. She lived just 2 miles away in Penarth with their son Arthur, who had been born in 1907. Shotton was leading a double life. Mamie knew nothing about it. The newlyweds first settled in Bristol before moving to Swansea, living in Trafalgar Terrace for 6 months. In late summer 1919, they moved to Caswell Bay, renting the remote cottage Tai Llanwydd, overlooking Swansea Bay. Throughout this time, Mamie was in frequent contact with her family in Sunderland. She wrote letters home regularly. But the letters revealed a troubling truth. Mamie's marriage was not happy. She told her family that George was violent and abusive. She described frequent arguments, growing violence, and her increasing desire to leave him. In one letter to a friend, she wrote, "The man is not all there. I don't think I will live with him much longer. My life is not worth living." She hinted that her husband would not allow her to return to the stage. She felt trapped. On November 12, 1919, Mamie's parents received what would be their final letter from their daughter. Shortly thereafter, they posted a reply, but the letter was returned to them marked "House Closed." Convinced an error had been made by the post office, they sent a reply-paid telegram. That too was returned with the same marking. Shortly before Christmas 1919, a telegram arrived at the Stuart household. It was supposedly from Mamie, wishing them compliments of the season. The wording was strange, formal, unlike her usual tone. No further correspondence from Mamie or George Shotton was received by her parents. In March 1920, staff at the Grosvenor Hotel on College Street in Swansea town centre noticed a leather trunk that had been left unclaimed for 3 months. A male guest had left it in December of the previous year. Following procedure, the hotel manager contacted police before opening it to cover themselves from theft claims. When officers opened the trunk, they found disturbing contents: 2 women's dresses and a pair of shoes, all cut up and torn, jewelry, a Bible, a rosary, a manicure set, and a scrap of paper with Mamie Stuart's parents' address written on it. Police contacted the Stuart family in Sunderland. They reported Mamie missing. They told police they had been actively trying to locate her for months. They handed over letters Mamie had sent them, documenting her unhappiness and the growing violence in her relationship. They also provided letters they had collected from friends of Mamie, all expressing concern. Scotland Yard was called in. Chief Inspector William Draper was dispatched to oversee the investigation. Police traced George Shotton. They were astonished to find him at an address in Langland, just 2 miles from the cottage at Caswell. He had been living his second life, alongside his wife Mary and their son Arthur. When questioned about Mamie, Shotton denied ever marrying her. Marrying 2 people at the same time, known as bigamy, could result in a prison sentence. He claimed he had known Mamie, but they were not married. He said he last saw her on December 6, 1919, in Oxford Street, Swansea. He suggested she had left him after an argument and returned to Sunderland. As for the trunk at the Grosvenor Hotel, he admitted leaving it there. He assumed Mamie had gone home, so he packed up her remaining belongings and left them at the hotel for safekeeping. Police investigated Shotton's background. They uncovered his prior marriage to Mary Leader. They found that he had falsely claimed to be a widower when marrying Mamie. They discovered letters Shotton had written to Mamie, in which he called her "my darling wife," "my sweet little wife," and signed them "your loving hubby," "from your hubby," and "your husband." The marriage was real. Shotton had lied. As months went by with no sighting of Mamie, police became convinced she had been murdered. But without a body, they could not charge him with murder. The law at the time prevented a suspect being tried for murder if there was no body. Unable to prove murder, they could only charge him with bigamy. On May 27, 1920, George Shotton was arrested in Swansea for bigamy. The trial began on July 27, 1920, at Glamorgan Assizes in Swansea. Evidence brought to trial included letters from Shotton to Mamie, in which he referred to her as his wife, as well as both marriage certificates. Mamie's sister, Edith, testified that in letters, Shotton often referred to Mamie as "my little wife" and signed with "your own loving husband." During the trial, the prosecutor, Sir Ellis Griffith KC, openly accused Shotton of murdering Mamie, though no murder charges could be brought without her body. Shotton maintained that Mamie had left him after an argument on December 6, 1919. He claimed she intended to return to her family in Sunderland or possibly London, but his account was undermined by inconsistencies. He had initially denied their marriage entirely. He even claimed his signature on the marriage certificate had been forged, despite corroborating evidence from witnesses and letters. The jury found George Shotton guilty of bigamy. He was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. Following his conviction and release, his wife Mary divorced him. Shotton severed all relations with his family. He moved to Tintern, where he ran a small holding. People there remembered him as a charming chap, a regular church attendee, deeply involved with the local tennis club. He appeared to have rebuilt his life. But in 1938, Shotton was arrested again. He had threatened his sister Gladys Austin with a revolver. He was convicted of assault occasioning actual bodily harm on a woman and possessing a firearm. He was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment. After his release, he moved to Ledbury as an aircraft factory worker, later relocating to Bristol. He died there of natural causes on April 30, 1958. He was 77 years old. Over the years, numerous accounts of Mamie Stuart sightings surfaced. People claimed to have seen her as far away as Canada, South Africa, India, and Australia. One man, Thomas James, claimed he saw her in Karachi, India in the 1920s. Police could not confirm any of these sightings. By the mid-1920s, investigators at Scotland Yard began referring to this case as the perfect crime. They were convinced Shotton had killed Mamie. They simply could not prove it. Then, on October 10, 1961, 42 years after Mamie disappeared, 3 potholers exploring an abandoned lead mine at Brandy Cove on the Gower Peninsula made a gruesome discovery. About 50 feet inside the narrow mine shaft, hidden behind a slab of rock, they found human remains. The skeleton was incomplete, but clearly human. Jewelry was found with the remains: a gold wedding ring, a diamond engagement ring, gilt copper stole tassels, scraps of clothing and footwear. Police were called. The remains were carefully removed and sent for examination. The location of the mine was just 200 yards from Tai Lan Wyd, the cottage where Mamie Stuart had lived with George Shotton. Forensic examination began. Although the body was completely skeletonized, the location and general description matched that of Mamie Stuart. The jewelry and scraps of clothing were sent to the National Museum of Wales. They confirmed the gilt copper stole tassels were most fashionable around 1920. The gold wedding ring and diamond engagement ring were found to have been manufactured in 1912 and 1918, respectively, indicating the woman had died soon after the First World War. Mrs. Hearn, Mamie's friend, who was now an elderly lady, was shown the jewelry. She identified the rings as belonging to Mamie Stuart. A police report also mentioned that a 63-year-old woman who had known Mamie in Sunderland between 1918 and 1920 from playing together in a stage show was shown photographs of the jewelry. She thought it was possible the diamond ring was one she had seen Mamie possess. She also had some recollection that a tassel found amongst the remains was part of a grey feather boa Mamie had owned. However, the woman admitted she had no very clear recollection as 40 years had passed. Forensic scientists used a technique called photographic superimposition. They placed the skull over a life-sized portrait of Mamie Stuart. The match was exact. The remains were those of Mamie Stuart. The examination revealed horrifying details. Mamie's body had been cut into 3 parts using a saw. Both her upper arm bones, shoulder blades, and parts of her thoracic spine had been sawn through. Both thighs had been cut above the knees. Her killer had dismembered her body to fit it into containers for disposal. An inquest was held at Gowerton. On December 15, 1961, the coroner's jury returned their verdict. The remains were those of Mamie Stuart. She had been murdered. There was insufficient evidence to show the exact cause of death due to the absence of soft tissue. She was murdered sometime between November 12, 1919 and December 6, 1919. The jury determined that she was murdered by George Shotton. The verdict rested on several key factors. George Shotton had opportunity. The couple resided in a cottage near Mumbles in Swansea, close to the Brandy Cove mine where the remains were found. He had motive. The couple had frequent arguments. Shotton's bigamous marriage had already led to his conviction and imprisonment in 1920, and there was witness testimony. An 83-year-old retired postman named William Simons came forward during the inquest. He testified that in December 1919, as he had been delivering mail to Tai Laneth, he had observed Shotton struggling to put a large sack into the back of a small yellow van parked outside the front gate of the couple's cottage. Simons had offered to help with the heavy load. Shotton had looked up, seen his blue uniform, and replied, "No, no, no. Oh God, you gave me a fright. For a minute I thought you were a policeman." He had then placed the load into the van and driven in the direction of Brandy Cove. Simons had not informed police at the time. He had not thought anything of it until Mamie's body was found decades later. The coroner asked the jury a simple question: can you imagine any reason for sawing up anyone if the person had committed suicide or if the death was accidental? The answer was clear. Mamie Stuart had been murdered. George Shotton was responsible. But Shotton had been dead for 3 years. He had died in Bristol on April 30th, 1958, never facing trial for Mamie's murder. The verdict came too late for justice to be served. And there was one final tragedy. Mamie's family in Sunderland were completely left out of the loop. They were oblivious to the fact that her remains had been found. Mamie was not originally from Swansea, so no one local knew who her family were or how to contact them. After being left in an abandoned mineshaft for 42 years, Mamie Stuart's remains were stored in a cupboard at a Cardiff forensic laboratory for a further 58 years. Her skeleton was retained by Cardiff University and used as a teaching aid by famous pathologist Bernard Knight. No effort was made to trace her family and return her body for burial. In 2019, a woman named Susie Oldnall had been researching her family tree. She discovered she was related to Mamie Stuart, the victim of the famous Chorus Girl mystery. She was in fact her great-niece. After further inquiries, she managed to track down where Mamie's remains had ended up. When she learned they had been stored in a cupboard for nearly 60 years, she said to herself, "I'm not having this." She made it her mission to get her remains laid to rest. Finally, after 100 years, Mamie got a proper Christian funeral and burial. It was by now 2020. She was interred at Bishop Wearmouth Cemetery in Sunderland, alongside other members of her family from that time. Mamie was laid to rest at last. Mamie Stuart was 26 years old when she died. She had been a dancer, a showgirl, a woman who loved performing and dreamed of continuing her career. She married George Shotton, believing he was a widower, believing he loved her, believing they would build a life together. Instead, she found herself trapped in an abusive marriage with a violent man who was already married to someone else. Sometime between November 12th and December 6th, 1919, George Shotton killed her. He dismembered her body with a saw. He loaded the remains into a sack. He drove to an abandoned mineshaft at Brandy Cove and hid her body behind a slab of rock. Then he returned to his life, leaving her belongings at a hotel, telling police she had left him after an argument. He was convicted of bigamy and served 18 months in prison. He walked free, rebuilt his life, and died of natural causes in 1958, never answering for Mamie's murder. It was only after his death that her body was found, that the truth was confirmed, that a coroner's jury named him as her killer. The case became known as the Chorus Girl mystery. It had every ingredient that sold newspapers: a relatable and glamorous victim, a sex scandal, an unsolvable mystery, a scurrilous prime suspect who escaped justice. For decades, people wondered what had happened to Mamie Stuart. Some believed she was alive somewhere, living under a new name. Others believed Shotton had killed her, but could never prove it. The discovery in 1961 answered those questions. Mamie Stuart had been murdered. Her body had been hidden just 200 yards from the cottage where she lived. George Shotton had killed her, dismembered her body, and walked away. He had gotten away with murder for nearly 40 years. The case remains one of Wales's most tragic unsolved murders, even though the killer was identified by the coroner's jury. Shotton was never tried in a criminal court. He was never convicted of murder. He died a free man, his guilt established only after he could no longer be punished for it. Mamie's story is a warning about domestic violence, about men who lie and manipulate, about victims who are isolated and trapped. She wrote to her family about the abuse. She told friends she feared for her life. She tried to leave, but George Shotton would not let her go, and when she became too much of a problem, he killed her. Her body lay hidden for 42 years. Her remains sat in a cupboard for 58 more. It took 100 years for Mamie Stuart to receive a proper burial, 100 years for her family to bring her home, 100 years for the chorus girl to finally rest in peace.